What if cathedrals were never as simple as they seem? They are usually described as churches, built for worship, prayer, and public ceremony, and on the surface that explanation sounds complete. For centuries, that has been the accepted view. Yet the moment we look beyond labels and focus on design, the subject becomes less clear. These structures are not only large, they are immense, highly organized, and often built with a level of planning that still feels surprising. This raises questions. If the main goal was to create a place for prayer, why were so many cathedrals designed on such a massive scale? Why do they appear closer to engineered systems than simple public gathering spaces? The physical details make the mystery harder to ignore. Enormous stone blocks were lifted into place long before modern machines. Ceilings rose to extreme heights. Arches, columns, and walls were arranged with careful proportion. Stained glass was installed far above eye level in ways that still seem difficult to imagine. Official history says these projects were completed over generations by skilled craftsmen, supported by faith, labor, and time. That may well be true. But even with that explanation, some parts do not fully make sense. Why did buildings meant for worship require such demanding construction methods? Why was so much effort directed toward precision, balance, and structural complexity? Then there are the less obvious features. In many cathedrals, sound behaves in unusual ways. Voices carry. Music expands. Certain tones seem to linger in the stone and air longer than expected. Light also appears carefully managed. Windows are not simply decorative. In some cases, their placement suggests deliberate attention to direction, timing, and atmosphere. At first, it seems normal. Great religions often build spaces that inspire emotion. But there's a problem. Inspiration alone may not explain the repeated attention to acoustics, resonance, alignment, and light. Some believe these choices were symbolic. Others disagree and wonder whether they served a deeper purpose that is no longer clearly named. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult. A cathedral can certainly be a church, and many clearly were used that way. But usage and design are not always the same thing. Some buildings feel as if worship was only one layer placed over a more complex original intention. That does not prove an alternative function. It simply leaves an open question. If these places were only meant for prayer, why do so many of their features seem to point beyond prayer? Why does their form suggest a level of purpose that still feels partially hidden? The more closely these structures are examined, the harder it becomes to say the usual explanation fully answers what they were built to do. The official explanation is well known and, on the surface, it seems complete. Cathedrals are described as Christian houses of worship, built to honor God and guide the faithful. Their great height is said to symbolize heaven. Their stained glass windows are often explained as a way to teach sacred stories to people who could not read. Their bells mark time, called communities to prayer, and reinforced the rhythm of religious life. In this view, each part of the structure had a clear spiritual role. The altar, the chapels, the towers, and the imagery all fit within a religious framework. For many historians, this is enough to explain what cathedrals were and why they were built. But this raises questions. If the explanation is complete, why do so many design choices seem to go beyond what simple worship would require? That traditional view does explain a great deal. It matches the historical role cathedrals played across medieval Europe, where religion shaped public life, education, and political power. These were not small local buildings. They were major centers of ritual, authority, and identity. So it makes sense that they would be impressive. At first, it seems normal that a powerful religion would build on a grand scale. But there's a problem. Symbolism does not always explain construction. In many cathedrals, the technical precision appears unusually advanced. The layout, the balance of weight, and the repeated use of specific proportions suggest planning at a level that feels more exact than purely ceremonial needs would demand. It doesn't fully make sense that a building intended mainly for prayer would require this much structural complexity unless something else also mattered. Certain details make the question harder to dismiss. Why were some proportions repeated with what looks almost like mathematical discipline? Why do similar forms appear again and again across different cathedrals, even when they were built in different places and periods? And why were so many of these buildings placed on older sacred sites, where the location itself already carried meaning long before the cathedral was built? That may be coincidence, or it may reflect continuity. But this is where it becomes unclear. In some cases, the alignment of the structure seems unusually deliberate, as if orientation was important for more than ritual use alone. Some believe that it's simply part of sacred tradition. Others disagree and see signs of a deeper design logic that was never fully explained. There's also the question of sound. Some features appear to shape resonance, echo, and vibration in ways that seem intentional. This may have enhanced prayer and music, and that is a reasonable explanation. Yet even here, uncertainty remains. If these were only churches, why does the architecture sometimes feel almost engineered around sound itself? Some believe this reflects the skill of medieval builders. Others think the word church may describe how the buildings were used later, but not fully why they were first designed in such a precise and unusual way. And that possibility leaves the official explanation looking less certain than it first appears. As the details accumulate, the mystery becomes harder to ignore. Many cathedrals contain features that seem devotional on the surface, yet beneath that surface they raise technical questions. Their vaulted ceilings are usually described as symbols of grandeur and faith, and that may be partly true. But those ceilings also do something very specific. They shape sound. In some cathedral interiors, even a quiet voice can travel farther than expected. Chants do not simply dissipate. Organ notes seem to expand, reflect, and settle into the stone in ways that feel almost controlled. At first, this seems normal. A religious building would naturally be designed to support prayer and music. But there's a problem. In many cases, the acoustic effect feels too refined to be accidental. This raises questions. Were these spaces only meant to inspire worship, or were they also designed with a deeper understanding of sound and resonance? Then there's the question of light. In many cathedrals, sunlight enters through carefully placed windows at particular angles, and at certain times of day or year the effect becomes remarkably precise. This is often explained as spiritual symbolism, and that explanation may be valid to a point. Light has always carried religious meaning. It can represent divinity, revelation, or the presence of God. But this is where it becomes unclear. In some structures, the placement of windows, openings, and interior spaces appears so exact that symbolism alone does not seem to explain it fully. Some believe these choices were simply artistic. Others disagree. They point out that repeated patterns of orientation and timing suggest knowledge of geometry, direction, and seasonal movement that appears unusually advanced, especially when similar design logic appears in cathedrals far apart from one another. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult. If these buildings were only churches, why do so many design choices seem to serve several functions at once? They support ceremony, yes, but they also shape movement, direct sound, control light, and influence atmosphere in ways that feel layered rather than simple. A person entering such a space is not only given a place to pray. They are guided through an environment that seems carefully calibrated. That may still fit within religion, but it doesn't fully make sense if every unusual feature is dismissed as decoration or symbolism. Some believe the builders were combining spiritual purpose with practical knowledge. Others think certain effects may have mattered more than later generations understood. None of this proves an alternative purpose, and that point is important. The question is not whether the official explanation is false, but whether it is complete. There is an uneasy gap between the accepted story and the physical evidence found in the buildings themselves. The more closely these structures are examined, the more complex they appear. And the more complex they appear, the harder it becomes to treat them as simple places of worship without asking what else their design may have been intended to do. The real tension appears when these details stop looking isolated and start looking repeated. Across different countries, different builders, and different centuries, cathedrals often return to the same strange priorities. They rise to unusual heights, as if vertical scale itself mattered beyond simple visibility. They follow long central axes with striking consistency. Their stonework often reflects careful proportion, not just strength. Beneath many of them are crypts, chambers, or older underground spaces that seem too significant to dismiss as minor additions. Towers also raise questions. In some cases, they appear far larger than what would be needed for bells alone. Then there are the floors, marked with circles, symbols, and geometric paths whose meaning is not always clearly explained. One example may mean little, but when the same features appear again and again, it becomes harder to treat them as random choices or local style. At first, it seems normal that religious architecture would share common forms. Traditions spread. Builders copied successful designs. Sacred spaces often follow established patterns. That explanation may be partly true. But there's a problem. These repeated features do not always seem purely symbolic or decorative. Some appear practical, but their practical purpose is unclear. Why preserve such exact alignments? Why repeat certain spatial relationships so consistently? Why include underground structures, oversized towers, and symbolic floor plans in so many places if their meaning was only secondary? This raises questions, especially when the same design logic appears across regions with different political and cultural histories. Some believe this is simply what sacred architecture looks like at its highest level. Others disagree and argue that repetition of this kind may point to something older than style. The question becomes even more difficult when earlier foundations are considered. Many cathedrals stand on sites that were already important long before Christianity arrived. Some were built over Roman buildings. Others appear connected to pagan sanctuaries or locations that had already been treated as sacred for centuries. On its own, that may not seem unusual. Religions often build over earlier places of importance. But this is where it becomes unclear. In some cases, the newer structure does not seem to erase the older pattern. Instead, it appears to preserve it. The orientation remains. The central line remains. The importance of the site remains. That suggests continuity, not complete replacement. And if continuity is present, then what exactly was being continued? Some believe the church inherited earlier knowledge and gave it a new religious meaning. In that view, the cathedral became a Christian structure built upon older sacred principles. Others think something more complicated may have happened. They suggest the original purpose of certain forms was gradually forgotten, while the forms themselves remained in use because they still carried power, symbolism, or function. It doesn't fully make sense, but it cannot be ignored either. If that possibility is correct, then cathedrals may be less like inventions of one period and more like later versions of a much older design idea whose first purpose is still not fully understood. So what are the possible explanations? The simplest answer is the official one. Cathedrals were religious buildings, made grand by faith, wealth, and human ambition. In that view, there is no hidden function. The scale was meant to inspire all. The height pointed toward heaven. The detail honored God. Bells, stained glass, towers, and chapels all belong to the slow development of sacred architecture. Many historians support this reading because it fits written records and the clear religious use of these buildings. At first, it seems reasonable to stop there, but there is still a problem. Some features feel more precise and more layered than this explanation fully accounts for. That is why other theories continue to circulate. Some believe cathedrals preserved older sacred knowledge inside a Christian form. In that reading, the church may have inherited earlier ideas about space, alignment, proportion, and atmosphere, then gave them new meaning. Others disagree and see no need for an older source. Still, this raises questions. Why do certain patterns appear so consistently across time and place? Why do some cathedrals seem to preserve older site logic rather than replace it? If the forms were only symbolic, why do they sometimes look as if they were designed to do something as well as represent something? Another theory focuses less on belief and more on function. Some researchers suggest cathedrals may have worked as acoustic instruments, carefully shaped spaces where sound was controlled for psychological or ceremonial effect. That does not mean they were not churches. It suggests worship may have been only one layer of use. A building that amplifies chant, extends resonance, and shapes silence may affect people in ways that go beyond ordinary ritual. There are also more speculative ideas. Some point to light, magnetism, resonance, or other natural forces that may have mattered to earlier builders. But this is where it becomes unclear. Some believe these theories go too far. Others think they remain possible because important questions are still unanswered. None of these explanations fully resolves the mystery, and that is why the subject remains open. The official view explains much, but perhaps not everything. The alternative views are intriguing, but hard to prove. The buildings remain in place, massive and quiet, while the meaning behind some of their design choices stays uncertain. Maybe cathedrals were only churches. Maybe they were churches built over something older. Or maybe their purpose was divided across several layers, and only the religious layer kept its name. It doesn't fully make sense, but that may be the point. The closer these structures are examined, the more they seem to hold onto something that history describes only partly, leaving the question still open.